our speaker tonight, Kavita Ramdas, is the president and CEO for the last 13 years of the Global Fund for Women. She did her graduate work at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, then went on to the MacArthur Foundation in Chicago, where she worked working on domestic violence issues and population and community issues. She said that she just barely didn't overlap with Obama there, but worked with a lot of community organizers and was impressed at what a difficult job it was. Then she moved on to become president and CEO of the Global Fund for Women, which is located in San Francisco. She's dedicated herself to empowering women worldwide with financial resources to increase, for instance, girls' access to education, defending women's rights to health and reproductive rights, preventing violence against women, and advancing women's political participation. She served on the board of the Women's Funding Network, the Women's Rights Prize of the Gruber Foundation, and the Ethical Globalization Initiative. She's the recipient of numerous philanthropic and leadership awards, including most recently the Haridas and Bean Chaudhry Award for Distinguished Service presented by the California Institute for Integrated Studies. She recently joined the Global Development Advisory Panel of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Advisory Panel of the Asian University for Women, and she's on the Board of Trustees for her old alma mater, Princeton. So we welcome you to University of Washington, and thank you for speaking at our Washington Global Health Alliance. Kavita, thank you.
Thank you so much, Wes, and thank you all of you. I must say that I am incredibly impressed that you could tear yourselves away from that wonderful weather outside. I have been hailing. It's so nice to see people I recognize in the audience. I have been to Seattle many times, and it is one of my favorite cities, although the weather is not usually the reason I love Seattle. So I've decided I'm going to take Indian credit for having brought Indian weather to Seattle. I want to thank all of the members of the WHA Alliance. It's truly becoming, as we were just talking, King Holmes and I, a model for many different parts of the world. And thank you for inviting me to come and be with you and be part of this speaker series. None of this would be possible without the extraordinary Darren Wade, who you all, I'm sure, know, but who the Global Fund who the Global Fund for Women considers a one-man marching band for our cause. I want to thank Jennifer Lucero Earls, who has so generously offered to be my chauffeur this whole time. So I'm extraordinarily indebted, and I know that she comes from another great city, from New York. So I'm very, very appreciative. I also want to take a moment to introduce you to a colleague of mine who's here with me from the Global Fund for Women. And although I will be at the reception only for a short time, Susanna will be there for a little bit longer, and I hope you'll have a chance to meet her. So Susanna Handa, who's Development Officer at the Global Fund, and if you can't catch me, she has lots of great answers to all the questions you're wanting to know more about, or at least can put you in touch with other people who can give you those answers. So thank you very much again. I was wondering, as you looked at the title of this talk, whether you thought maybe I had mixed up my memos and thought I was actually coming to address the National Security Council. But so far, they have not extended me an invitation to come lecture them. Do let them know that I'd be willing. And I thought, well, if they had invited me, what might I begin my talk with? And I thought, well, it would probably begin with an understanding of how the relatively narrow ways in which they define security, primarily as the preservation of the nation state and its boundaries, ultimately fails to ensure what we at the Global Fund for Women tend to think of as being true security, which is the security of human beings who happen to live both within and outside of those boundaries of a nation state. And so I wanted to say a little bit about what I think my talk today will hope to focus on. so that you have a sense of, I tend to be someone, as I was saying to Susanna, who should have taken a class in improv at some point. So I tend to do talks more like a jazz riff than an organized symphony. But broadly, the 3 points that I'm hoping to touch on is, one, what is the relationship between what we consider to be health with what we often hear in terms of the issues of security, national security, and then a topic that has been of significant concern to those of us who do work in human rights and in women's rights particularly, the question that, the topic that we refer to as militarized societies or militarism. And I want to talk about, as a first point, what's the relationship between those 3 things. The second piece is, we were hearing a lot about what is and is not possible these days in terms of the healthcare debate. And, although I do feel like saying, will the real socialized medicine please stand up every now and again, I do think we need to spend a little bit of time looking at how the choices that we make in terms of priorities and in terms of where we are investing resources, financial resources, make it possible for us to think or not think about having the kind of inclusive health that we would actually like to see for all human beings, both here in the United States and around the world. And then thirdly, and obviously you're not surprised at this, but I want to say a little bit about where I think women are offering us some really creative solutions and where we might have opportunities to think differently about investing resources. So if we had the money and we had the political will to then begin to actually put it into places that we thought, who might be some of our partners, and why do I think women on the ground in different parts of the world would make good partners? That's sort of the third point. So if I go too far off course, you can come back and tell me that in questions, but it's just a fair warning. So what does health have to do with security? I tend to use our working definition at the Global Fund for Women. To us, security is about total human security. That means security of your body, what is often referred to as bodily integrity. People cannot do things to your body unless you consent to that. It means security of voice. We often refer to that in the United States as the concept of free speech, civil liberties, your right to express dissent, your right to express disagreement, your right to express whatever the point of view is that you as an individual and as a citizen or as a group of collective citizens have. Security of livelihoods, which is economic security, and in this last year and a half, we might talk a little bit about financial security, which is a sense a little bit larger than your right to a livelihood, which is a sense that the systems around you, the financial systems that we count on, whether that's banking, where you put your savings, how you invested in a house, that you can have some degree of security that the things you invest in will actually be there tomorrow or 10 years from now or 15 years from now, and that somebody in Wall Street will not have kind of made strange magic and made them magically disappear. Legal security, equal protection under the law, especially for minority populations. This is incredibly important in different parts of the world, where simply sometimes by virtue of your being a woman, an ethnic minority, a Roma, a Gypsy, you're denied your rights. So that's another form of security. And then, of course, the most basic human security that we can think of: access to food, access to shelter, and yes, access to healthcare. To me, security means having a sense of being safe from physical harm, from assaults on your person, being able to count on the rule of law if those things should happen, and not living in fear. So there's another aspect to this. It's a sort of a mental and emotional security, if you will. When you define security in this way, it becomes immediately evident to those of us who work on women's human rights that there is a very large group of people, in fact more than half of the world's population, for whom that understanding of security and that reality simply doesn't exist. By virtue of them being the poorest of the poor and being subjected to extraordinary levels of violence, they have nothing close to that sense of well-being, which is another way in which we might say health. Add to this a reality of a world in which nations grossly overinvest in military security and underinvest in the components that make up human security, and the basic notion of healthy individuals within a healthy society is really compromised. Societies that pour resources into their military have far less available to pay for everything else. What do I mean when I talk about a militarized society? A militarized society is a society that explicitly or implicitly condones or promotes the use of force or violence to settle conflict of all kinds, whether between individuals or between groups or between nations. In such environment, the dominant ideology, whether stated or unstated, is invariably might makes right, and that puts those who have less power, physical, economic, social, at the bottom of the pyramid. It's where, again, women and children tend to find themselves in almost every society in the world. When militarism combines, as it often does, with the ideology of patriarchy, which accords women intrinsically lower value than men simply by virtue of their being women, it results in what most of the world faces today: stunningly high levels of violence against women in every part of the globe. The scale of this violence truly is at the level of an epidemic. And for those of you who are students of public health, who are students of medicine, who are students of human rights, you know that there are frightening statistics that go with this. But before I completely pepper you with statistics, I thought it might be good to see what this looks like, this combination of these factors in the lives of individual women, and give you a little bit of a personal insight into some of the women that the Global Fund for Women works with in Colombia. So I'm going to show you a small video, a very short video that gives you an insight into the lives of a grantee partner of ours called the League of Displaced Women in Colombia. This is an extraordinary group of women led by Patricia Guerrero, a human rights and legal advocate, a trained lawyer, that works within this sort of nexus that I was just talking about.
Colombia's internal armed conflict has been an integral part of everyday life in this Caribbean nation for more than 40 years. The long, bitter struggle involves paramilitary groups, guerrilla factions, drug lords, and the Colombian government itself. Women have systematically been victims of heinous war crimes such as sexual slavery, forced prostitution, and rape. More than 1 million women and children have lost their husbands or parents and have been left to care for themselves in squalid conditions. That is, until Patricia Guerrero formed the League for Displaced Women and founded the City of Women, a model for sheltering some of these forgotten families.
40 años de conflicto interno armado en Colombia.
40 years of internal armed conflict in Colombia is a problem that has lasted through more than one generation of women. My grandmother was a victim of the war. My mother was a victim of the war. I am a victim of the war, and I do not want my daughters to be victims of the internal war in Colombia. The struggle for justice and reparation is a very long process in Colombia, and that is why we have been working for the last 10 years. But we needed a place to live. We needed productive projects. We needed training. Our children needed education, and that is another reason we are fighting.
La Ciudad de las Mujeres es una ciudad en resistencia.
The City of Women is a statement of resistance against the war that surrounds us in Colombia. These homes are especially important in the struggle because they were built by the women who were displaced by the conflict and lost their families to violence. These homes are a reality that have given dignity to the lives of more than 500 people. The League for Displaced Women is unique because it is a group of women who are heads of their households and are survivors of the war. They have transformed themselves into true social leaders and an example for women of Colombia and women of Latin America.
Estamos logrando que las Naciones Unidas nos
We have attained the partnership of the United Nations in that process, and because of our efforts, the Constitutional Court has completely revamped their laws that protect the displaced population. We want to transform this system. It's not only about the women in the city of women. It's about all women, Colombian women, women of the world. The Global Fund for Women always believed in me, and they continue to do so. They know that they can count on me to help other women in Colombia. I am very grateful to them, and from here, I am sending them a kiss.
I shared that video in part because I think it's easy to think about militarized societies as societies that we envision as being sort of fully in a state of war, whatever that means. But I think what's so important to recognize is that this issue of an underlying assumption around militarization is so important for us to understand. It's not about being in an actual state of conflict. You could say that the south side of Chicago or the East Oakland or East Palo Alto is a militarized state. It is an environment in which the use of force and the presence of weapons has created sort of an environment within which there are assumptions made about how conflict will be resolved, and what that actually means is a profoundly insecure environment for everybody who lives within that, but particularly for women and children who rarely are actually the people who own or use the weapons themselves. And so part of the reason to share Colombia with you is that while certainly some of you are aware of the civil war that has been going on and the violence that has been inflicted both by FARC, the rebels within Colombia, but also by various forms of government militarized forces. It's extraordinarily important to understand that scenarios like that are playing out in all kinds of places, whether that is in Somalia or whether it is because of in the drug wars of Mexico, and in increasingly far too many societies around the world. So I think that for us, being able to kind of share that understanding of what does it mean, we see women's health as being profoundly threatened by the growing militarization of societies, the increasing numbers of armed conflict, and the persistence of war. I want to share a couple of examples of why I believe that for those of us who see ourselves as global health advocates, it is so important for us to understand this nexus between increasingly militarized societies and societies in which the use of force, which is somehow justified at one level, then becomes almost impossible to undermine at any other level. So if you say we can, in Afghanistan or Pakistan, drop bombs from a drone and take out 37 people in a wedding party, you cannot, with any real degree of legitimacy, say, and then, by the way, all of you should give up all your weapons and wage a peaceful struggle to move whatever your agendas are, whether that is to have a Talibanized state in Afghanistan or in Pakistan. You end up with a logic that just simply doesn't hold water. And this, maybe it's very appropriate, 3 days ago was Gandhi's birthday, and I think he would have been appalled at the world that that we see around us today. In part, I think that world is one in which we have essentially ceased to imagine a world in which we can resolve conflicts without resorting to weapons. So we now have many, many, many more times the number of weapons that we need to actually destroy our whole world many times over. But that understanding has also penetrated into our societies as a whole. Let me share a few examples. Afghanistan. We were just talking a little earlier. Foreign troops provide a convenient excuse for local militias, whether that's the Taliban, whether it's warlords, whether it is any armed group, to repress women under the guise of resisting foreign invasion. The presence of armed troops themselves in any region of the world, and Afghanistan is no exception, brings with it an immediate high price that women pay, literally with their bodies. There is almost no place on earth where there have been large extended stays by foreign troops, which are mainly male, where women's bodies have not then been bought and sold in a bazaar, whether that goes on legitimately, underground in a black market or whatever. The Global Fund supports women's groups in Korea that are still dealing with that reality of servicing American servicemen on bases. That was true in Okinawa. That is true and has been true in many, many different parts of the world. It's true in my country, in India, where Indian armed forces are in occupation-like situations in both Kashmir and in many parts of Northeast India, and women have paid a brutal price for that occupation, whether that is in terms of selling their bodies for what is often called survival sex. In Afghanistan 5 years ago, I couldn't meet with a single women's organization that said girls were not essentially being bought and sold or were having sex for food, essentially, to survive and to be able to take that money home to their families. Yet you see Afghan women and girls defying the odds. We were just talking about programs to train midwives. We're talking about increased access for human rights trainings. Girls who you all know from reading the newspaper have defied even acid attacks and have gone back to school. So it's not that there is any lack here of a commitment to being able to envision a different world. It's simply to say that we can't necessarily, when we say, well, for our national security, we must have X number of troops, or for the security of women in Afghanistan, you need X number of troops. You have to realize that that is a very double-edged sword, to say the least. And that's an area that I would like us to be able to think about and maybe discuss a little bit more in questions. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, many of you will have read or will be reading soon Cheryl Woodan and Nick Kristoff's new book, Half the Sky. In that, they describe the DRC as the world capital of rape. Now, while that's a very, sensational title, and while it certainly addresses the fact that since 1998, 6 million people have died, estimated in the Congo, and over 500,000 women estimated to have been raped in one form or another. Women suffer gang rapes, rapes in public, being humiliated, sexual torture, introduction of objects, most often weapons, actually. Rifles, guns, knives, other forms of weapons, and repetitive trauma to women's sexual organs as a result of this insertion of objects. Communities collectively are being taught a lesson using rape as a weapon of war to humiliate and impose a kind of a demasculation or emasculation of societies, which leads us to ask, what is this kind of masculinization of societies to begin with? There is a big difference, however, with the growing flow of arms into the DRC. So I might argue that the real rape of the Congo began a long time ago, began with colonial invasion, began with the fact that to this day, almost every large country in the world has multinational conglomerates that depend on the critical mineral wealth that is extracted in the same sense of rape out of the Congo and taken out of that country with, a sort of a nod to the human rights violations that are necessary for those minerals to go out. A few statistics. The US imports 60% of its cobalt from the DRC. If we really intended to end the violence, we could require all Western companies to simply stop doing business with the DRC. We are talking about sanctions on Iran, but there has been no discussion, really, about sanctions on Western companies to stop doing this kind of business. The other minerals that you know about, tin, tantalum, diamonds, coltan. One family, the Kabilas, have been in power in the Congo since 1997, with active backing from most Western powers, again. And then the repercussions of the Rwandan war, again, which we now have significant amount of information about. So while Rwanda is free of genocide, there is now ongoing repercussion that the people of the Congo are paying. Despite this reality, our experience at the Global Fund has been that Congolese women are not just simply victims or survivors of sexual assault or violence. They are also making these connections. They won recently passage of a landmark bill criminalizing sexual violence. And one of the groups I want to share with you a little bit about is the Women Activists for the Defense of Human Rights, or SOFAD. The group trains women paralegals to conduct women's rights and legal education at the village level. They've established over 50 peace networks across the Congo and linked over 20,000 women and youth in peace efforts. Each network serves as a facilitator, arbiter, and as a mediator of disputes, both within the village and across villages, working in collaboration with traditional chiefs and local administrators. They're also working with armed groups to look at the whole question of the proliferation of small weapons. It's amazing to me how rarely stories about rape of women in the Congo are tied to the sale of arms to the Congo. I don't know how many of you know that the UK, the US, and France earned more money in the last 3 years from sales of small arms and weapons to the Congo than the entire amount of their assistance in foreign aid for survival or humanitarian assistance. You cannot speak with one hand about trying to make a difference in women's health, and on the other hand, be contributing to the very situation that is making them so vulnerable. And I think that is where we as global health advocates have to open our eyes to the connections and the linkages that may not seem so obvious to us at first glance. Let's go to a different part of the world, Israel and Palestine. We've done a lot of work in both of those regions that have known essentially no peace for over 60 years since the State of Israel was established, on the heels of, again, a colonized part of the world. The daily experience of Palestinian women is that of living in a form of apartheid, military checkpoints, closures that severely constrain their movement. Palestinian women have some of the world's highest mortality rates. I spent 3 weeks in both Palestine, in Gaza, in the West Bank, and in Israel, talking with women's groups across borders and realizing what an incredibly high price women on both sides of that conflict are paying for an extraordinarily highly militarized zone in which everything is seen in terms of using violence to resolve conflicts. Palestinian children suffer from malnutrition, lack of access to adequate health care, a variety of serious mental health problems that are related to the stress of living under occupation. Last December, Israel's attack on Gaza, again, you just heard the controversy around the Goldstone report, killed, according to some estimates, as many as 1,300 Palestinians and wounded over 4,000. Again, contested information about how many of these were civilians, 735 women, over 1,000 children from one estimate. And on the Israeli side, much, much fewer numbers by their estimates. So regardless, the numbers are horrific, and regardless, the numbers lead us to understand that nothing in this kind of an environment can actually be seen as being promoting health. One of our advisors in Gaza said, the brunt of war and the reorganization of social fabric is left to women. Palestinian women will be busy making ends meet as they deal with rising poverty and unemployment. All our dreams about law reform, strategic gender needs will be on the shelf for years to come. And this brings me to another aspect about how highly militarized societies also take another form of toll on women. Domestic violence is extraordinarily high in the Palestinian territories. We had a board member, Sumaya Farhat Nasser, who has been working with groups in Ramallah on the West Bank to try and teach how you do peaceful conflict resolution. The rates of incest and the rates of domestic violence are incredibly closely correlated with growing unemployment. So growing male unemployment spikes domestic violence. It also spikes other kinds of family abuse. And what for me was truly shattering about this, and I think what is much less known in the United States, is that if you talk to Israeli women, Israeli Jewish women are also paying an extraordinarily high price for this conflict. A recent article in Haaretz, an Israeli newspaper, reports a very sharp rise in the number of Israeli women killed by men carrying licensed guns. Some 47% of women murdered by their partners or relatives in the past 5 years were killed by security guards, soldiers, or police officers who carried licensed weapons. Between October 2000 and April 2005, close to 40 women were murdered with the use of firearms, compared to 14 women in the 4 years preceding the Intifada. So as Israeli society became more militarized in response to perceived conflict, again, Israeli women paying a very, very high price in terms of violence within their own communities. One of the groups, again, that the Global Fund for Women supports in Israel, an Israeli feminist group called Kol Ha'isha, has this wonderful quote: "Paradoxically, the existence of weapons, mainly in the hands of men, aimed at increasing the public sense of security, actually increases the lack of security in the private sphere." And I think this is a profoundly important understanding for us, to understand how public and private understandings of security are not so straightforward. So just having many more troops with weapons may increase your sense of living in a secure environment. What it actually does within the private sphere is increase the level of vulnerability. 1 in 3 Israeli women will be sexually assaulted at least once in her lifetime. Issues of sexual harassment and violence against women are too common in Israel today to require statistical proof. Rape cases have become commonplace, including many cases of group rape and gang rape. And lastly, Israel is a country that has become a destination for trafficking victims from much of the former Soviet Union. So again, I think a vision of a society that we rarely see within that context. And I think again of the conversation I had with a young Israeli mother who said to me, "We have no money for schools in Israel. The budget has been cut and cut and cut so that we can pay for military expenditure. And therefore, we as women have to now pick our children up at school at 12 o'clock, which means we cannot actually hold a job." So there is a direct correlation in terms of the continued gender stereotypes and assumptions about what women's roles should be in society, even in a society which actually requires women to do military service. The flip side of that on the military service issue is that I spoke to Palestinian mothers who said, actually, Israeli women soldiers are who we fear more than Israeli men. And I said, why is that? I mean, and they said because the environment that they work in is such that they feel they have to prove themselves so much more than men, that they are tough enough, that they are strong enough. So Israeli women will shoot first and ask questions later, soldiers in the army, whereas sometimes we can have an opportunity to talk with male soldiers. If we don't begin to understand that our notions of gender equality have to be fundamentally changed in our understanding around how we create healthier, truly more secure environments, we will end up with these kinds of realities that are often hidden to us. And then lest we think this is all a question of what's happening out there, and I know I don't have to say much to a group of people who already are health advocates here in the United States. It is important, I said to Wes as we were talking, that I had a very eye-opening introduction as an Indian woman coming to work on issues of community development in the United States, that the third world is well and alive right here in the United States. You can't see it as often or as easily or as visibly, but when more than 15% or close to 15% of your population lives below the poverty line, and when 70% of those are women and children, you have a real set of dilemmas here that have to deal with many of the same things we've been talking about in these other contexts. What is the impact of a nation state whose expenditures and investments privilege military expenditure over human capital expenditure. Let me tell you quickly a few statistics in the United States. 600 women are raped or sexually assaulted every day. Every day, 600 women. 3 are killed by an intimate partner every day. In 2008, a new government report showing huge increases in the incidences of domestic violence, rape, and sexual assault over a 2-year period in the United States showed a 42% increase in reported domestic violence and a 25% increase in the reported incident of rape and sexual assault. If you think about these numbers, close to 250,000, that is 250,000 women or girls, were raped or sexually assaulted in 2007, up from close to 200,000 in 2005. I would argue that these statistics are not unrelated to the fact that the United States was essentially and has been in a state of war. In a state of war, although we don't see it here in these comfortable environments, in a state of war since 2001. And this relationship between domestic violence and being in an environment that basically glorifies violence and sees violence as being something that is how we assure our own security are deeply related. This is especially true because amongst all violent crimes, actually all other forms of crimes except crimes against women, domestic violence, rape, and sexual assault, everything else decreased during that period of time. So we have to be asking ourselves some really hard questions about what this means. Within military structures in the United States, the situation of women is even more dismaying. A report from Congresswoman Jane Harman in 2007 noted that only 181 out of 2,212 reports of military sexual assault, or 8%, were actually referred to any kind of trial or court-martial. By comparison, 40% of those arrested in the civilian world on such charges are prosecuted. Women serving in the US military today, the report said, are more likely to be raped by a fellow soldier than to be killed by enemy fire in Iraq or Afghanistan. So when we are outraged by the so-called tribal actions of the DRC, we have to stop for a second and think about that number. 250,000 women and girls. That's 250,000 women and girls. And we have to ask ourselves, how is it possible that we don't see that as a public health crisis in the most fundamental terms? Women make up 15% of all US military personnel, up significantly from 1972 when they made up less than 2%. Of these women in the military, more than half are women of color. For most women, the military offers opportunities for jobs, healthcare, ironically, pensions, and other benefits such as the chance for education. But there are really high costs for joining the military. Within 1 year of deployment, over 100 US women soldiers reported incidents of rape and sexual assault. Most of them did not receive the most basic medical care, such as emergency contraception, rape evidence kits, testing for STDs, HIV testing, or rape crisis counseling. In fact, as a US servicewoman, you must pay for your own rape crisis kit and you must also pay for an abortion resulting from a rape, because the US government does not cover that as part of its health care. The children, girlfriends, wives, or significant others of male US servicemen are also at higher risk for abuse by boyfriends, husbands, and fathers, as well as by other military personnel, particularly higher ranking officers up the line of command. Rates of domestic violence are 3 to 5 times higher in military couples than in comparable civilian ones. From 1997 to 2001, over 10,000 cases of spousal abuse were reported annually. And I don't know how many of you read and were moved as I was by the stories about the murders of women on Fort Bragg, of servicemen returning back from having served in Iraq or Afghanistan. Women who have been victimized in the military or by military partners are much more likely to report chronic health problems, lower health-related quality of life, are addictions to prescription drugs, and an annual income of less than $25,000. These are hardly the signs, I would argue, of a developed economy. These are hardly the signs of a healthy society. These are not statistics that give the United States any shred of credibility to be a leader in what is desperately needed right now, which is a global campaign on health around the world. How can we be at the table and being taken seriously on being a champion for the Millennium Development Goals when we are dealing with these kinds of realities inside our own society? And what is our role? What is our role, you and me, sitting in this audience? Those of us who are healthcare practitioners, those of us who are in philanthropy, those of us who are just concerned citizens. What is it that we can do to begin to make a difference? Because it is not enough to be able to go onto a global stage and to lecture others when one's own double standards are so evident, and when one's failure to acknowledge what one is doing within one's own country makes it so much more difficult to be taken seriously in the rest of the world. One way, I would argue, is to begin by stopping feeding the beast. And by that I mean, very honestly, this machine which is producing more weapons than we need for a society and then that the world needs. This is the famous, if there are any economists in the room, the guns versus butter argument that you learn in Econ 101. We have too many guns and way too little butter. There is no butter for bread in the United States anymore. And to look at the statistics and to realize how easily we could pay for healthcare with making just a few changes in terms of where we currently invest resources. World military spending has been on the rise since 1998. We did go through a period where it was actually falling, and that was right after the so-called end of the Cold War. But in 2007, nation states invested a staggering $1.339 billion worldwide in military budgets. The US's share of that, over 50%. It's almost $4 billion per year. In contrast, the United Nations spends about $20 billion a year in its so-called peacekeeping forces. In 2002, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute estimated that approximately $200 billion would be all that nations actually needed to provide decent housing, healthcare, and education for everyone. This is about a quarter of the sum invested in militaries. But weapons sales are a huge and very profitable industry, and I think we have to understand that we cannot ignore these facts, but we must engage them. When our Congress and administration says there is no money for healthcare reform, but we improve a new missile defense system or 10 new submarines, it is up to us to make the connection. It is up to us to ask the questions. In the greening of the economy, we also have to push for demilitarization whenever possible, so that arms manufacturers are not seen as the engines of economic growth. Secondly, we can ask questions around how we can get resources to women on the ground. We've made some good starts. There's a new act in Congress around violence against women. Hillary Clinton took a great position at the United Nations Security Council. And women's rights advocates, luckily for us, have long made the connection between demilitarization and more resources for the kinds of things that actually do create healthier, more sustainable communities. If women like Patricia Guerrero, who you saw, can risk their lives in Colombia to build places like the City of Women, then we can and must be allies of women like her around the world by holding our governments, our philanthropic sectors, and our civil societies and corporations accountable for their actions. There is a critical need to hear women's voices on how they find alternative ways to deal with conflict. And we have many, many examples of how that has worked, including Liberia, where, for those of you who haven't seen the movie Pray the Devil Back to Hell, might be a great screening for you to do sometime over here with WGHA. Women in Liberia who essentially brought the peace process to actually realization of the ending of many years of civil war. There is a way for us to strengthen those voices within the peace movement, within the women's movement, within the labor movement, for health advocates and academics and researchers not to shy away from this topic or to think that somehow expenditure on militaries has nothing to do with our concern about HIV. In fact, militarized societies are one of the most likely places where HIV/AIDS transmission happens. What we're doing at the Global Fund is to launch a new initiative to support women resisting militarism. We call it affectionately Resist, Reclaim, Restore, Militarism No More. We would like to be able to make $10 million, additional $10 million available to women's rights organizations on the ground in 170 countries, and even in the places where you don't normally think of as being places of conflict. We also want women to be able to share experiences. We all have forgotten about the 20,000 to 50,000 women who were raped in Bosnia. They know something about what it's like to be used within a military conflict, and they have something to share with women in the Congo and in other parts of the world. Those are some of the exchanges that we would like to make possible. We also have to look very hard at what our current consumption rates are and what the root of militarism is around. And I would say that part of that really has to do with what we saw this last year and the financial crisis that we looked at. Women's movements are credited for having come up with the term intersectionality, which means everything is connected, and so it is. You cannot have global capitalism of the kind that we have had, 3.0 capitalism maybe, in which greed, excessive greed, defines what it is that we actually want to export to the rest of the world. When India and China have a middle class that wants exactly the same kind of lifestyle as those of us here in the United States have come to expect as a birthright, a lifestyle in which nobody switches off lights, in which entire office buildings are on all night long, in which as long as the price of gas continues to be what it is, we will continue to consume. We will forget some of what was most important about Gandhi's message, which is not just about non-violent resistance, but really his greatest insight in my mind was the relationship between boundless consumption, social injustice, and unending military aggression. Because if you want to consume at that rate, you need to have the force to be able to continue to consume at that rate. If you tamp down your consumption, as he said, Gandhi said, there's enough in this world for every person's need, but not enough for every person's greed. Unless we realize that truth, our failure as a society and our failure really as global health advocates will be to have failed to see the connections between how we live our lives, the amount that we consume, the necessity to then preserve that right and way of life by force, and the continuing aggression and violence that creates the kind of extraordinary health problems that I've just described to you. I believe that there truly is a way for us to be able to shift that, and I believe that we can make a choice that makes a commitment to a true and an inclusive security. But to do that, we must change the way in which we define health so that we can see health as something far more than simply whether you have been to see a doctor or whether you have access to what we understand right now as healthcare. It must be truly a human security that we all fight for. Thank you.
Kavita, I want to thank you and also remind folks that they can come up and ask questions at the microphone. And I'll just start out by applauding your quote. I love we cease to imagine a world where we can resolve conflicts without weapons. And I want to point out that the Department of Global Health is sponsoring a Western Regional International Health Conference on war and conflict here in April, where we hope to take up some of these topics, organized by our own Darren Wade, Amy Hagopian, and Becky Bartlin. But I actually had a question for you. So, and I hope, I always get worried about asking a political question on campus, but I'm going to go for it and say, if you were President Obama's, I almost said President Bush's, security advisor, what would you say to him about what he should tell his generals now about what to do in Afghanistan next that will end up benefiting women and children in Afghanistan?
I think I would share with him the words of our board member, Sakina Yaqubi, who serves as the head of the Afghan Institute for Learning, which is an organization that works on delivering both education and healthcare services and human rights education around Afghanistan, which is that, yes, President Obama, we need troops, but we need troops of doctors, we need troops of midwives, we need troops of nurses and engineers and arborists to replant the extraordinary fruit trees that Afghanistan was once so famous for. Those of us who grew up in India know that the term Kabuliwala, the person who came from Kabul, was, you know, you looked for that person because they brought the most delicious figs, the most delicious walnuts, the most delicious almonds, and those orchards in Afghanistan have been bare for a long time. It's not an easy transition. You do not just simply switch off the military war machine. You had an extraordinarily wise insight on this many years ago from a president who talked about the industrial military complex and talked about what it required to undo that complex. And we were making some strides in that direction. I think the events of 9/11 and the sense of extraordinary fear that really paralyzed so much of the United States has abated somewhat, but not completely. And I think so much has been set in motion that for this administration to think that in less than 6 months it could undo the work of 8 years would be, more than optimistic. But I do think it would be incredibly important for President Obama to be able to say to his generals, set a time frame by which investments, there will be a real reversal in terms of the investments that we make into Afghanistan that are human capital investments, and a decrease in the investments that are around weapons. Because what is happening essentially is that more weapons are flooding the country, and whether you end up giving those weapons into the hands of Afghan soldiers or whether those weapons will end up in the hands of Afghan militants, that doesn't make the personal security situation for women any more secure. And I think it won't be until we really begin to transform that we can see a real difference. So I think, we move in measured steps. It is an incremental process. I do not expect President Obama to bring the troops home tomorrow, but I do expect, at the very least, a clear statement about how we will get to a place in no less than 5 years in which that investment will be really inverted, and our investments in human capital in Afghanistan will be significantly more than what our investments are in the military. That, by the way, would be true for what I would say for Israel and Egypt as well, where the current investments in supporting Israeli military expenditures far, far, far outweigh the investments that could be going into supporting Israel's other human infrastructure.
Thank you, Kavita.